The Bank of Canada is cutting rates, the government is cutting back on visas for foreign students and temporary foreign workers, and the NDP has finally broken their supply and confidence agreement with the Liberal Party. So you're probably wondering, what's going on? That's right, folks, it's time for another Canadian news update with your old pal MillennialMoron. I've had a pretty busy summer, so it's been a few months since you last heard from me, but a lot has happened, and I wanted to give an update while I keep working on the deep dive video I've been preparing for the past 4 months or so. But first, you might be asking why I'm wearing this cool, stylish hat. That's because I got it from the channel's first official business supporter, Chapman Outdoors. It's a small fishing equipment company in Kelowna, BC, run by longtime viewer Justin Chapman. I had the chance to go fishing with Justin one morning recently when I was passing by Kelowna, and the basic idea of his company is to provide fishing equipment that's actually useful for fishing in Canada at a reasonable price. There's a few subscription box options as well as individual lures, but since I'm starting to get back into fishing as an adult, he put together a really nice variety box of lures for me to take home, and I said, hey, this is great, why don't you just sell this? So now you can get this box of 40 practical fly fishing lures in a waterproof case, which is perfect if you're a moron like me who's just starting out. There's even a section on the website that suggests what lures to use during which season, along with some other useful info. I'll put the link in the description and you can use the promo code MORON for $25 off. Promo code MORON. Anyway, first up, the Bank of Canada has continued cutting the policy interest rate, and with 2 more quarter-point cuts being delivered in July and September, the policy rate is now sitting at 4.25%, down from 5% a few months ago, which should provide a bit of relief to variable rate mortgage holders. In addition, the 5-year bond yield has been falling by a similar amount, also down about 75 basis points over the last few months, meaning that fixed-rate mortgages are coming down as well. However, the spread between new and existing lending is still about 165 basis points, meaning that people with mortgage renewals coming up will still be feeling some pressure, with their payments likely increasing after renewal. Despite a lot of speculation by the real estate industry that rate cuts would lead to a boom in housing market activity and a return to price growth, we've yet to see that materialize. In the GTA, traditionally one of the hottest housing markets in the country, both the number of sales and the benchmark price were down from 2023, which was already a weak year. As of August, the benchmark price of a home in the GTA is down about 23.2% since the peak in March of 2022, with the real values being down 29.4% when adjusted for inflation. As of the latest Canada-wide data in July, prices are down 15% or 21.9% when adjusted for inflation. But back to the rate cuts, just like before, the actual overnight lending rate between banks has been hovering several basis points above the target, with the actual rate currently sitting around 4.3%, so the Bank of Canada has been using overnight repo operations, in other words, injecting money into the overnight lending market, to keep the rate from drifting higher. Last time I talked about this, the amount of money the bank was injecting was around $5 to $10 billion per night, but in the past few months it's usually been $16 billion per night, although on September 11th it was over $21 billion. That may sound concerning, but the main reason for the increase is that in May, they changed cash bond trades in the secondary market from 2-day settlement to 1-day settlement, which lumped them into the overnight lending market. The details are kind of complicated, but basically, the overnight lending market has gotten a lot bigger, so the repo operations have gotten larger as well. Keep in mind that these amounts are also just for overnight lending, so they don't roll over to the next day. $16 billion per night doesn't add up over time because the money they're injecting disappears every morning. Still, the amount of money they're adding now represents around 30 to 40% of the entire overnight lending market on any given night, which means they're needing to add quite a bit of liquidity to try to keep rates on target. Next, we have some updates on the new rules around student visas and temporary foreign workers. I'd like to introduce this segment by showing a clip of what I said 7.5 months ago in the January 26th update. Interestingly, back in 2017, a consultant named David Trick wrote a report on these public-private partnerships for the Ontario government. In the report, he said that they basically have no oversight or quality control and should be shut down as soon as possible. As a result of the report, the government at the time put a moratorium on these partnerships with the eventual goal of eliminating them entirely. However, in 2019, the new Ontario government announced that the 2017 report was a bunch of nonsense and we should have all the public-private partnerships we can handle. Anyway, the government predicts that the student visa cap will result in as much as a 50% drop in international students in Ontario, so expect news stories to start popping up in the next year or two about how Ontario colleges are facing a budget crisis. Now, as we've seen in the news in the past couple of weeks, post-secondary institutions, particularly in Ontario, are struggling to figure out their budgets as the number of international students drops sharply. This really shouldn't be a surprise, as Ontario has been making various cuts to post-secondary funding since the 1990s in an effort to reduce the provincial deficit. For many years, universities covered the difference by raising tuition, but this was becoming unpopular over time, so in 2019, the Ford government implemented a tuition freeze for domestic students. As a result, universities and colleges began increasingly relying on international students, whose tuition is not capped, leading to a rapid increase in the number of study visas being issued. So, as budget problems are starting to loom large at post-secondary institutions across the country, expect some more public debate over who exactly should pay for education and when. Moving right along to a related issue, the government is also signaling that they'll be decreasing the number of temporary foreign workers in the country, although details so far are slim. So far, they're rolling back a couple of recent changes. For example, employers will no longer be able to hire temporary foreign workers for low-wage positions if local unemployment is higher than 6%, and will no longer be able to hire more than 10% of their total workforce through the TFW program. It's not clear what prompted this sudden policy change from the government, but perhaps they were swayed by this op-ed piece in the Toronto Star about fixing the TFW program, written all the way back in 2014 by a young upstart MP named Justin Trudeau. Personally, I think this is welcome news for a program that has been described as a breeding ground for contemporary forms of slavery, although according to this article in the Financial Times, executives are worried that the measures will curb their supply of cheap labor. That's a perfectly normal sentence. Now, to go on a bit of a tangent here, one of the issues we've seen with this program has to do with something called a Labor Market Impact Assessment, or LMIA. This is a document that an employer needs to get before hiring a TFW, saying that they made an effort to hire a worker within Canada but were unable to find anyone for the role. The problem with this is that these applications are basically a rubber stamp approval, even with unemployment continuing to rise across the country. Personally, I find it hard to believe that companies like Tim Hortons are struggling to find people with the skills required to do the job. Another problem with the TFW program is that the work permits are closed, meaning that they're tied to the specific employer that hired the worker. This gives the employer an incredible amount of control over the worker and their residency status in Canada. On top of creating a workforce that's very easy to exploit and abuse, this has led to something that's becoming more of a hot topic these days, known as LMIA Fraud. It's a fairly complex issue, but the short version is, international recruiters pitch the TFW program to prospective immigrants as a fast track to Canada with a path to permanent residency, and then charge large fees for setting up an LMIA and a job with a prospective employer who often gets a kickback from the recruiter. In some cases, the jobs may not even exist at all. The CBC published an article hinting at this LMIA issue back in May, with one worker stating that they had already paid $5,000 for the immigration application, $500 in legal fees, and $28,000 to their employer. Now, as always, I think it's important to note that while LMIA fraud is getting more public attention lately, it's absolutely nothing new. Last year, when I was researching these issues, I came across this 2010 report from the RCMP on human trafficking, which covers cases reported from 2005 to 2009. In the report, they lay out more or less the entire same scheme that we're talking about now. Recruiters lure in foreign workers with misleading claims of good pay and solid immigration prospects, get a labor market opinion to hire them, then charge them huge service fees, skim their wages, and so on. The systems in place for LMIA fraud today are obviously more complex and mature, but fundamentally it's the same thing. My point is, while I see a lot of people blaming the current mess on liberal immigration policies and saying the solution is to just vote someone else in, the government already knew about these problems all through the Harper years and through the first 8 years of the Trudeau government, but nobody took any action on it until the public became broadly aware of it. That's why it's important to actually be informed about issues like this and hold politicians accountable for acting on them instead of just trusting that whoever you vote for will actually be proactive about fixing things. Personally, I think the easiest way to fix this issue outright, which should have been done 15 or 20 years ago, is by putting in much stricter rules for issuing an LMIA. Companies should have to provide actual proof that they tried to hire someone within Canada, and low-wage streams could be shut down entirely, considering that the unemployment rate is now 6.6% across the country. Employers being able to access the TFW program at all should be the exception, not the rule. But besides the TFW program, you may have seen this recent article in the Vancouver Sun about the International Mobility Program, or IMP. Longtime viewers may remember that I also talked about this back in May. Now, back in 2014, the Temporary Foreign Worker Program was split into two programs, the TFW Program and the International Mobility Program. The IMP is a lot like the TFW program, except it covers workers from countries who we have a reciprocal agreement with, and it doesn't require a labor market assessment to hire someone through that stream. Well, we can see that after the Liberals were elected in 2015, they did actually reduce the size of the TFW program, which is something they campaigned on 10 years ago in the lead up to the election. The reduction in the TFW program was more than made up for by an increase in the International Mobility Program, where employers don't even have to demonstrate that they've made an effort to hire a domestic employee. The two programs have slightly different rules, but the key difference is that for the IMP, employers don't need to make an attempt to hire a domestic employee, they can just go directly to hiring a low-cost foreign worker. This program gets a lot less attention from the media and politicians, but is now several times the size of the TFW program. So, while you see politicians talking quite a bit about changes to the TFW program, the IMP also needs to be part of the discussion if we want to make effective policy changes. Finally, the NDP has withdrawn from their long-standing supply and confidence agreement with the Liberal Party in an apparent attempt to distance themselves from the unpopular Trudeau government before the next election. This has raised the prospect of an election coming earlier than expected, but it doesn't mean they'll try to topple the government immediately, it just means that there's no longer a formal agreement in place. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre reacted to this move with a statement on Wednesday.
Singh suddenly had a change of heart, or so he said, publishing a video claiming that he was no longer in the costly coalition. Well, let's look at the wording. The costly coalition is called a supply and confidence agreement. So if you're pulling out, you have to vote non-confidence. If you don't, you're still in the agreement. No matter what your video stunt would have everyone else believe.
Just as a side note, this is not actually how parliamentary democracy works. Opposition parties aren't obligated to vote against the government in confidence motions in the absence of a formal agreement. This is something Poilievre himself might remember from his years as part of a minority government. Obviously, people will say exiting the supply and confidence agreement is meaningless until they call for an election, but personally, I would say that if either party can unilaterally break the agreement at any time with no consequences, the agreement itself was meaningless from the beginning. So, like the agreement itself, this may end up being a fairly irrelevant move that's just being done for political posturing. But again, I'd like to take a look back at a previous Friday update, this time from March 29th. One other thing that was included in the bill was an item about making sure the election date doesn't interfere with a religious or cultural celebration, which just so happens to change the deadline for the next election by 1 week, from October 20th to October 27th, because October 20th, 2025 would be a conflict with Diwali. In press statements, they also mentioned Alberta's municipal elections falling on the same day. But another implication of this change is that if the government happens to last all the way to the election deadline, 80 more MPs will become eligible for their pensions. The main beneficiaries would be Conservative MPs, with 32 people becoming eligible, then the Liberals with 22, the Bloc Quebecois with 20, and the NDP with 6. This means that in addition to potentially granting pension eligibility to 22 of their own members, the Liberals would be creating 58 people in opposition parties with a strong financial incentive to make sure the government lasts for the full term. And because the Liberals currently hold 156 out of 336 seats, they only need 13 extra votes to maintain confidence. Furthermore, the Bloc Quebecois only has 32 seats in Parliament, which means that the 20 members whose pension eligibility hangs in the balance form a strong majority of the current sitting members of the party. This includes party leader Yves-François Blanchet. So it wouldn't surprise me if we see the Bloc stepping up to support this Elections Act bill, or if they step in next year to provide support on confidence motions, which could make this the first minority government ever to last a full 4 years. Also worth noting, Bill C-65 was introduced on March 20th, one day before the non-confidence motion vote, and the entire Bloc Quebecois voted against the motion. So, as expected, just a couple of days after the NDP announced they were breaking the agreement, the Bloc Quebecois stepped in to say that they were looking to make a deal with the Liberals and regain the balance of power in Parliament. Of course, in the same press statement on Wednesday, Poilievre announced that he would be calling for a non-confidence motion against the Liberal government.
So I have an announcement and a challenge. I'm announcing that common sense Conservatives will put forward a non-confidence motion at the earliest possible opportunity. And I'm asking Jagmeet Singh and the NDP to commit unequivocally before Monday's by-elections. Will they vote non-confidence to bring down the costly coalition and trigger a carbon tax election? Or will Jagmeet Singh sell out Canadians again? Which will it be? It's put up or shut up time for the NDP. There will be a carbon tax election, and in it, Canadians will decide whether they keep the NDP Liberals in power.
So, apart from the general incoherence of demanding that the NDP vote against the NDP Liberals, kind of mixing up his buzzwords there, obviously Poilievre knows that this vote is going to fail, and this is just political posturing. The NDP needs more time to distance themselves from the Liberals before an election. This is something that they've already started on by saying that they're against the Liberals' carbon tax plan. The Bloc Quebecois still needs to secure their pensions, and will probably also take the opportunity to try to get some kind of funding win for Quebec to help win their seats again in the next election. Neither party has an interest in helping the Conservatives win a majority because that means they'll get nothing for the next 4 years. I don't have a crystal ball, but what I expect to happen here is that the Conservatives will call the vote, the motion will fail with the NDP and the Bloc both voting against it, then Poilievre will blame it on the NDP Liberal coalition in the English media, which will probably work, and blame it on the Bloc Liberal alliance in the French media, which probably won't work. Or I'm totally wrong, and by the time you see this video, we might already be in the middle of a snap election. So to wrap up, the point of this video is not to say that I'm great at predicting things. I'm not. But when you understand the underlying motivations of Canadian politics, things become a lot more predictable. The way I see it, politics in Canada is not really about policy or principles, it's about patronage. Politicians want to get money and jobs for themselves and their little buddies. As a result, policies aren't determined by what people think is the best way to run the country, they're determined by what wins elections. As a result, we get policies that are designed to sound good, not to actually be effective and improve the lives of Canadians. This is a big part of why I try to avoid expressing support for any party or even my own political views in these videos. I think better results can only come when we, as citizens, understand issues more deeply and have more nuanced opinions on what the policies should be. We need to understand problems not just in terms of how they affect us today, but also how they were first formed and how they developed over time. If politicians are only interested in winning elections, then we should base our votes on demanding policies that are actually effective. All the immigration reforms that we're seeing now are a perfect example of this. In public discourse, people seem to think that there's a big difference between the Liberals and Conservatives on immigration. But if you look back at what they've actually done and what they've actually said, they've always been aligned on immigration policy, the messaging has just changed a little. When the Conservatives were expanding the TFW and international student programs, they said it was about economic benefits. When the Liberals were doing it, it was more about progressiveness and diversity. However, now that the programs have grown so much that even the general public is aware of the problems of worker exploitation, lack of opportunities, and substandard living conditions for newcomers, both parties changed their tune on the issue. Not only did they both change their messaging to say that we needed to reduce immigration, they both did it on the same day. I think it's important to realize that while we might want to change in government, just swapping out the parties is not going to be enough. Hopefully, we learned our lesson over the past decade from the Liberals promising to do politics differently, then doing everything exactly the same, only more so. It's not enough to just get new people in charge, we have to actually press them to start implementing smart policies with long-term thinking, otherwise we're just going to keep moving from crisis to crisis while the politicians continue to collect their paychecks. That means we need to start having real, mature conversations with each other about what we want Canada to accomplish 10, 20, or 50 years down the line, not just what we're upset about today. Anyway, that's all for this week, so as always, thanks for watching and enjoy your weekend.